My name is Michael Quinn. I came to Kuranda in 1986. And why? Because I'd received a beautiful offer from my then brother-in-law to come and build a house on the banks of the Barron River.
And did you?
With my family, of course. And indeed, yes, that did happen. When I say I built it, well, it was largely with the labour of others, including my brother-in-law. However, I was good at fetching and carrying. Well, he had asked me previous to me coming what on earth I would do when I got here. And off the top of my head, because I'd just finished a degree in social anthropology at the University of Sydney, I said I'd love to study the mythology of the people into whose lands I was coming to build a house. It seemed, a rather tenuous idea, but that's the idea I had when I arrived.
What does that mean, Michael?
Well, it means that when I actually got here, I was very nervous about meeting the Aboriginal people of the area. I had seen Aboriginal people in Redfern and in New South Wales, but I have to say that in all my 7 years of being there, I don't think I'd ever talked to anybody.
And what happened then?
Well, coming here, there was something rather delightful happened to me. I had been busy with the house building and gone down to the Barron River for a swim. I heard voices coming from across the river, but I couldn't see who was singing out because there was an island in the way. And I knew there was an Aboriginal community there at Kuranda. So I swam around the island, and there were two boys there, and they had bows and arrows, and they were actually shooting freshwater crayfish, which I found out they called jungi. Ironically, the same name that the people here applied to the police force of Queensland. In some way, those jungi, once they got their nippers on you, didn't let you go. There were other names for police that I later discovered, like bullyman and gulaji, which means wild thing. I asked the boys, whose country is this? A very naive question, perhaps. But without any hesitation, one of the boys jumped out of the river and began to perform what I later came to understand as a warama, a shake-a-leg dance, right on the bank of the river, and he proclaimed, "This is Jabogai country." I was so delighted to hear these words that I asked him and his friend to come back and meet my kids, and I got my notebook out, and I began writing down the words that he said he knew. He was rather apologetic. He didn't know if some of the words he was using were Jabogai words or Gugu Yalanji words, and he was very sad that at school, I believe he was able to study Indonesian or German, but he wished he could study his ancestral language. Having spent something like 7 years in Sydney, teaching English to overseas visitors, and studying social anthropology at the same time, I thought that it was a tragedy that this boy couldn't be taught or discover anything about his ancestral language. 2 weeks went by, and there this boy was on the road hitchhiking, and I stopped and gave him a lift. He asked me if I'd like to meet his uncle, Lalfie Thompson. And I'd heard that name mentioned. People had said, "Oh, if you're serious, you should go and speak to that man. He's the last man of the tribe with the tribal markings on his chest." Wadir, I later came to discover. Rather thick ridges of scar tissue, without which no boy could ever hope to become a man and get a bride. And so here I was now at Oak Forest, meeting this man who ended up being the man who influenced my life more than any other. And I knelt down at his feet and asked him to tell me about his people and the history and the culture. And he laughed at me, saying, "No way, Bigelow, not unless you learn our lingo," which to me was quite a big challenge, because if I'd wanted to study Indonesian or Japanese or Chinese, I could have found language cassettes, dictionaries, textbooks. But when it came to a language of this country, an indigenous language, there was nothing. I visited the Cairns Library and tried to find information about Jabbergai, and I was amazed that, given the fact that the Jabbergai people live close to one of the major cities on the eastern seaboard, there were only a few paragraphs that I could discover at the library. And I began to think, had something so horrendous happened in the last century that this tale had been covered over? And in fact, now 28 years later, I indeed know the depths of the sad story of what happened to the Jabberganji people, like other tribes throughout Australia. I've learnt that here, round about 1911, there was a man who was a proprietor of one of the pubs in town who had written to the government of Queensland saying that he thought that the Aboriginal people of this area were healthy, they were free from any addictions to alcohol or opium, and that they were getting on well with the local farmers, and also that they were an asset for Kuranda's budding tourist operations, in that people would come up to Kuranda and see the people dance and maybe buy boomerangs and spears and so on. And so he was most against the idea that the people would be rounded up and put on a mission or a reserve. Well, tragically, around about, I think, 1914, I think the mission opened, but round about 1915, perhaps, the Jabbergai people were actually rounded up, even though they had revealed that they were integrated with the actual burgeoning white community here. And they were transported, they were taken to a place known by them as Munu Munu, that is Crooked Flaggy Creek, which became known as Mona Mona. And there the children were taken off the parents and the grandparents and put into single-sex dormitories, flogged if they spoke their language. And many of the tales were rather frightening for me. The spearmaker I befriended told me how the mission superintendent would sit on his veranda and throw down an apple core to the boys down below, who would fight over it. Also, he told me of this story. He was with a group of children, and the superintendent was there, and he was asking different children questions to do with the Bible. And without thinking, this old fellow, well, he was young then, he said, "Gary Nanya Jabbera, don't ask me." But he said it in lingo, and he was punished for that. It was, I have to remind myself, being English, that we've had a pretty bad reputation for linguistic tolerance. And in fact, with the Welsh, we used to put a Welsh knot, a wooden board around their necks for children in class who spoke in Welsh. And the only way they could get rid of it was to dob in someone else who had spoken Welsh. I think it I think it shows something of our conceit, perhaps the notion that we think we have the best language in the world or something. And it's rather tragic these days, where the world is losing more and more of its indigenous languages at the rate of one every 2 weeks, so I've heard. Because I think that each language that people have developed over this world provides a unique way of looking at whatever it is that we are in the middle of, this life. And that by losing languages, it's almost like we are becoming more rigidly monocular or something, or losing vision. What's the word? Blinkered, like a horse, you know. We can only see straight ahead of us through the language that we've grown up speaking. And some people say, well, if the world all began speaking the same language, maybe there would be a chance for peace and harmony. But I have to say, look at England, we've had civil wars. Look at the US, even people speaking the same tongue have had civil wars. Look at the French. Speaking one tongue is no guarantee of peace and harmony and social equilibrium. But taking away languages has a terrible consequence on the psyche of the people. I try to imagine myself if things had gone differently in the Second World War and that I'd had to grow up speaking Russian or German. I'm sure there would be others like me who would really want to know something of that language, our heritage that had been taken away from us. Because, after all, it provides us with the very ground of our being and our sense of self and identity. I have to say that when I met this man, Lalfrey Thompson, I fell under his spell. He was sad that the customs and the language of his people were being lost. And because I kept on going back to visit him, he believed that I had some integrity. And in a way, viewed me as some kind of bridge between then and the future. And I'm so grateful that he backed me up. Even though he was dying, he would come to the language meetings I started and be vomiting blood out the side of the car. But he came, and his presence with me it allowed me to be with other Jabaganji people who came to realize week by week, as I made up a lesson from what little I had gleaned, that my heart was taken by the language of this part of Australia. And I have to say that discovering, for me, coming from Liverpool on the far side of the world, discovering that Jabbergai language was a very beautiful thing, opening up a way of looking at this world that we're in, totally different to the way I'd grown up and the way of looking at the world I'd inherited from my own culture and people. And a way of looking at the world that made me a part of it, not apart from it. Something very important that I believe our civilization has lost, that we have actually alienated ourselves from the beauty of this planet that we live upon. The people had come under the control of the Aboriginal Protection Act, which I would repeat should really be viewed at in inverted commas, because protection or incarceration is the question, as people all over this land were suddenly moved off their own traditional areas and put onto places far away like Palm Island or Mona Mona, Munu Munu, Munamuna meaning Flaggy Creek, the place where Mona Mona was actually developed. In one way, we could say that the people actually found some kind of refuge there, because like in other places in Australia, Aboriginal people, if they're wandering round the bush and so on, had been prey, even until relatively, goodness, kind of recently, through the last century, prey to people, the colonisers, going out on expeditions which they called snipe shooting, which meant they were almost free to kill men, women, children, and hide these things away, as though the people here were kind of subhuman, or they were being treated like rodents, in fact. And I know that where I'd come to build a house, I had heard that way back, and I believe it would have been at the beginning of the last century, with the incoming colonizers, there was great famine in the 1880s and onwards, as people, the settlers, took up the best properties on the rivers for a start. The very lifeblood of the people, any hunter-gatherer, would have depended on the river, not only for its fish and its eels and all of that, and life-giving water, but all creatures have to go and drink, and if you're a hunter, then that river is a prime area for you to find your feed to satisfy your children. There was great starvation here. I heard from elders about a time when people were eating makara, white clay, medicine clay, to fill up their bellies. And round that time, this story freaked me out, that some farmer around here left out a sack of flour laced with strychnine, and many Aboriginal people died a horrifying death. So it makes me think, here we come to this country believing we are the civilized, but in fact, we are certainly the savages in this tale. And so, yes, for many Aboriginal people, possibly things like Mona Mona and reserves that the people were put upon did protect them from sudden death, from those colonizers who felt that they wanted to kind of exterminate the race of people that had been here before them, before us, practicing kind of things which we now realize are forms of ethnic cleansing. A kind of tragic, a very tragic story acted out. Also, the mission might have helped people when in other areas Aboriginal people were becoming addicted to opium and to alcohol. By being put upon the mission, it meant that such things became virtually impossible. And in some way, there would have been a protection of the young women, I have to say, in particular, from the ravages of sexual diseases brought into Australia by the coloniser. Diseases, venereal diseases that had not been here before. Our people took over the land. And so it's a complicated subject, and you would have had missionaries believing they were doing the right thing by the people and the humane thing. But to me there is a terrible tragedy in that the Christian missionaries failed to recognize the spiritual traditions of the people here that had prevailed for possibly as long as 60,000 years. And they could not recognize the fact that the people that they had incarcerated had an ancient history in which tales that they told without libraries and books, tales that they had told have been passed on since the last ice age. There are many stories of the coastal people recalling a time when Jabaganji territory actually extended right out to Yerbin, which we now know as the Barrier Reef. And there are tales of how, and this would have occurred at the end of the last ice age when the polar masses of ice began to melt and the sea level to rise, there are tales recounting the fact that the waters rose up and swallowed up all the country that had been the hunting grounds of the people, driving them back into the Bunda, the mountains. Times when one could walk out to places like what is now Green Island. These stories, we are faced with the fact that right here we have one of the longest lines of storytelling going back 20,000 years, 30,000 years. Stories that, because of the details they have encoded within them, actually refer to amazing events that have happened geologically and to this planet in that great depth of time. And that intimacy that they developed with these lands meant that each man and woman had to learn how to look after themselves, how to find medicines, how to find foods in the forest. Medicines that, I'm sad to say, nobody has been listening to the people. So much pharmaceutical knowledge has been lost by our believing that white man was at the top of the evolutionary tree. It only reflects how blind we can be. Far from deserving the title Homo sapiens, or knowing or wise man, well, hell, I'm afraid it's a totally different story of prejudice and ignorance.
So, Michael, what about the future?
The future, the dreaming, the story time, is an ever-present reality. Our appearance in this world is like a blink of time. And the truth of the dreaming and the story time, Bulvaru, the spirit of the story waters, will live forever. And that presence, those notions, they're very important to us because they reveal that human individuals are not contained within their skin, but actually are interconnected with all of life, from the flora and fauna of the forest to distant stars. And in fact, I would have to say that Western science actually is revealing some of the truths that ancient seers amongst the Jabaganji people and other Aboriginal peoples have known for millennia. That we are part of it all. We are interconnected with all of life. Oh, I have a strange feeling about Kuranda because back when I was 21, I left Liverpool and went hitchhiked all the way to India. And I guess being part of those times, I had the vague notion that I might discover myself. Well, I still haven't, I have to say, whatever that self is. And now I've come to believe that, in fact, we are not a self, but a multiplicity of selves. Kuranda became for me maybe the place that I was always trying to find. There is something about it And with my relationship with this ancient language, I feel a sense of connectivity with the birds that cry out and the sound of the rapids, and a kind of realization that whoever or whatever I am, that for 99.9% of the time that humans have been in this world, we have been hunter-gatherers, like the Jabaganji people. And that perhaps we've lost important things in our evolutionary fall, I don't know, into a state of industrial societies. To me, it's a rather sad story for human beings that we could become so alienated from the beautiful world we're a part of. Well, it reminds me of the fact that the human species is the only species on the planet that can allow actually strangers to come together and sit down peacefully and talk together. I heard recently that you couldn't, for example, get a crowd of 60 chimpanzees or some of our other relatives, if they came from different places, to sit down together without mayhem. So Homo sapiens has some particular quality, and that quality lies in the imaginary. That is, in fact, the world that we live in is an imaginary construct. For example, the fact that we believe in something called money. Well, give that money to a goat, perhaps, and it will chew it up. That no other species would identify with money in the way that we do. That there are so many elements of our life that in fact have no foundation in reality, which is quite strange, really, because, we talk about living in the real world. Well, we're one of the only species that doesn't live in the real world. We live in an imaginary world. And, for example, well, all of humankind are fascinated by story. And it's a very sad thing being a storyteller. But story, for better or worse, guides our lives, whether it's the story of democracy or radical Islam, that people fall under the spell of story, not recognizing it for what it is. And if we look around the world, we discover a world where different societies have whole pantheons of deities, and that no matter where we go, people will be believing in all kinds of spirits out there in the land we're living in, from fairies and pixies in Britain to Gangligan, the little hairy man of the bush here, and to the tall man, and to Bunanda, water fairies. That the imaginary is part and parcel of what it is that makes us human beings.
And about Kuranda?
Kuranda, when I first came, I was actually told that the meaning of Kuranda was meeting place of spirits. Actually, I think that's not a bad definition, because in the past, three tribes would come together at Nunbai, Platypus Place, which to me is the original word for this place we call Kuranda. 3 tribes, the Nyakali, the Bulwanji, the Jabaganji, would all meet in Nunbai for Warama. This is a meeting place of spirits, and today those spirits come from all around the world to this place. So it continues to be that meeting place of spirits.
And how do you feel about that?
Kuranda brings up mixed feelings for me. I believe that wherever you put a label on a place and call it heritage, you're going to discover the exact opposite is going to take place. So that a place becomes enshrined as heritage village or whatever. And these are empty words, and unfortunately the true heritage gets smashed down and knocked away. And it's another example of storytelling spin, because the true heritage is lost under the glossy, what can I call it? Well, whatever the word was, it's kind of one-dimensional veneer. Nawunyi nang Kuranda, I'm sitting here. Bana Junga Jungaya Binanundo. I'm listening to the waters running behind me. That sound of the Dangai, the rapids, the sounds of the Jaroi, the birds in the forest. They tell me that I belong here.